Well, the last couple years have been interesting, right? I mean, the pandemic or plandemic, depending on where you stand, don't worry, I'm not judging you, has really thrown the world for a loop. Whether you were clearing out grocery stores of toilet paper and Clorox wipes or informing retail workers on the ineffectiveness of masks.
I work for Costco and I'm asking this member to put on a mask because that is our company policy. So either wear the mask
And I'm not doing it because I woke up in a free country.
Everyone perceived this crisis differently. We had the bleach injectors, the mask protesters, the dreaded 5G explainers. We even had a group who, more than anything, just wanted to get a goddamn haircut. Needless to say, everyone was handling, or rather mishandling, this in their own way. I mean, seriously, what the shit was this?
Imagine there's no heaven.
Today we're going to be talking about two films that tell the same story but paint very different pictures of crisis and our collective responses to it. George A. Romero's The Crazies, released in 1973, and its 2010 remake, directed by Breck Eisner. So grab your hand sanitizers and N55s, or your MAGA hats and your picket signs, and let's begin. I said before that this is one story, not told over two films, but told by two films. And though the stories mostly begin and end in similar fashion, they end up painting radically different portraits on everything from small-town living to government bureaucracy, all the way to military invasion. So let's get the premise out of the way briefly, because once we know the similarities, it'll help highlight the differences between them. The Crazies tells the tale of a biohazard weapon named Trixie unleashed on an unsuspecting populace. The films then chronicle the subsequent fallout, the struggle for survival as the city is overrun with the virus and a military presence, and comments on the evil that mankind is capable of. But one is, I believe, a more honest account of how humans react during a crisis. The other is the imagined tightening of the screws, a QAnon wet dream disguised as a film. That's not to say that either film is bad or tacitly endorses extremist rhetoric. Both films slap, as the kids say. The kids do still say that. But one is definitely more interested in exploring how things fall apart rather than assigning blame for things having fallen. And now in Crisis, we have and will always be our own worst enemy. Since the plots are nearly identical, what with a virus infecting citizens of a small town, turning them into crazies, the government sending the military to try to contain it, and the citizens fighting back and escaping, let's instead focus on the few but significant differences between the films and how these differences beget two very different interpretations of crisis. How do films that overlap nearly 80% in their plot and beats end up utterly in opposition to one another? Well, like most things in life, it's all a matter of perspective. The earliest and most defining difference between the original and remake is perspective. The 1973 film's characters are organized into three factions: the citizens of Evans City, the military and science officers tasked with containment and finding a cure, and then separate from all, bureaucrats in windowless rooms who mull over about what to do about the ever-worsening situation. This is one of the first departures the remake takes, as it largely follows just the POV of its protagonist. By taking this wider scope, the original allows us to perceive this unfolding emergency from a bird's eye view. And what we see isn't malicious intent or a clear good guy, bad guy story. Instead, we get to witness the folly of all three factions. Now, communication, or lack thereof, can lead to a comedy of errors. One is simply unable to do the same with the remake. Its scope is so narrow and so singularly focused that the fact that the POV characters are in positions of societal authority is rendered irrelevant. The remake begins on the ground floor. It remains on the ground floor. We never glean any insights into the inner workings of the military or what's behind the thought process of the government. Because of this, one can only surmise that both are tyrannical and ill-natured. Compare that again with the original, which doesn't absolve the military, but it also doesn't demonize them. This allows the viewer to humanize and sympathize with the military faction as principled people up against a perilous situation. But more on that in a minute. The original isn't interested in assigning blame. It's wholly satisfied watching the slow-motion car wreck as it unfolds and leveling blame at all parties equally. The remake, however, if for no other reason than its perspective, is forced to perceive the very same threat as the worst possible scenario. A scenario that is binary in its morality. It's good versus bad. It's us versus them. One of the more inspired choices made by the original is the look and aesthetic for the infected, or rather, the lack of a look and aesthetic for the infected. In the original, there's no visible characteristic beyond peculiar behaviors such as incessant laughing or sustained paranoia. And considering that everyone is going through a military invasion and of course everyone is possibly a carrier, it's safe to say there's no shortage of paranoia. Everyone's a suspect, which heightens the slow-rolling dread of the film. Not to mention it also makes a bad scenario much worse for the military officers attempting to contain Trixie.
The whole thing's insane. How can you tell who's infected and who isn't?
In the remake, the Crazies are ghoulish, almost zombie-like. You can spot them from afar, which although more erratic and frenetic in nature, actually serves to lessen the suspense and impact of the infected. I know that seems counterintuitive, but by making the infected undetectable in the original and keeping the face of violent acts a human one, the impact of each life being taken hits much harder. The remake is less effective as a result, but it does break this depiction once and with wonderful results. In both versions of the film, Russell, the third POV character, eventually gets infected. Although in the remake, we never see him turn into the grotesque eventuality that the viewers have now come to expect. His behavior becomes erratic, his propensity for violence is heightened, but he never physically resembles the infected. He spends most of the third act of the film ramping up his violent acts and questioning his sanity. The fact that he remains human in appearance during this serves to show how Russell has become monstrous in a different way. The government's actions have transformed him into this paranoid, hyper-violent monster. In both films, Russell, now aware that he's more than likely infected, gains redemption by sacrificing himself so that David and Judy have the chance to escape, a very human action in the face of a dehumanizing fate he's certain to encounter. Russell is slain by the military, which in both films takes on a similar but ultimately different tone, due largely to how the military itself is depicted. The remake doesn't concern itself with the inner workings or processes of the military invaders, nor the government that wields them. They're made indistinguishable in the eyes of the character. We never leave the confines of our small-town emotional entry point, and as such, have no choice but to see the government and military as other and nefarious. I mean, they appear not even to be human, but rather a malevolent force that kills indiscriminately in the remake. There's never a scene in which the populace is ever held accountable for their actions because it's portrayed as something that is happening to them and not because of them. Every act of defiance is explained away as the only logical choice to be made, which would be fine in isolation, but the film has a bunch of conservative maxims throughout, from when bureaucrats do bad, take matters into your own hand, and that oldie but goodie, a good guy with a gun. And this is all portrayed innocently enough because the military is so cartoonishly evil in the remake. We find in the final scene that the entire population of Ogden Marsh has been systematically exterminated, the sick and healthy alike. And if there was any ambiguity left about government equals bad, the government literally nukes the town. Compare this to the military in the 1973 film, where two of the protagonists are Vietnam veterans. Colonel Peckham is shown to be a man of integrity and morals. The military certainly does bad in the film, no one's debating that. But even their appearance is front-facing towards public safety, towards containment, and reducing transmission. The lives lost feel like the sad result of incompetence mixed with the lack of communication, not the malicious intent of an authoritative and profoundly immoral government. In one version, the military is all-encompassing evil. In the other, they're put upon laborers making difficult decisions, not out of enjoyment, but because of the social and civil structures they have to believe in order to maintain civilization. So here we are, in year 3 of the pandemic, God help us.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that.
And when I watched the original Crazies last year as Omicron began to rear its ugly head, I was existentially floored for a few days by how much of our current situation is presented in a 50-year-old film. The 1973 film seems ripped from the headlines of our 24-hour news cycle. It's a film about the perils of the inability to communicate effectively, to be heard, and to be understood. Though the characters in this film are separated into 3 factions, the film maintains there's no us versus them. All 3 factions are equally to blame for the worsening of the situation. The government is poor at communicating the urgency of the situation to the military on the ground, who, in turn, are poor to communicate it to the townsfolk. The government sends officers and scientists into unprecedented circumstances, understaffed, uninformed, and lacking the necessary materials and equipment to do their jobs.
Jesus Christ, this is so random!
No one informs other sources of societal authority. Cops and firefighters are left in the dark, so they too are just reacting to the pandemonium as it unfolds instead of being helpful in corralling public support in the name of public safety. Civil disobedience exacerbates the situation. The citizens' initial compliance soon gives way to restlessness and revolt. In the end, 1,500 townsfolk die from Trixie and from being killed by the military, a number that is far higher than it would have been if proper communication had been utilized early enough to inform the citizens. Then again, the most true-to-life aspect of this film is the fact that even if the information were given in a timely fashion, we'd likely still be the cause of our prolonged suffering. As the final scenes of the original show a cure being manufactured, but on its way to transport, the doctor responsible is trampled and the cure destroyed by angry and petulant citizens. I think it's easy to see how a governmental force martial lawing their way to enact quarantines and lockdowns can be easily equivocated to our current crisis. But that would be a lazy equivocation. The idea that this is conspiratorial or malevolent is patently false. There's no big bad government with vile intentions. This isn't an extraordinary event happening to a select few. This is happening to all of us, and all of us have to perceive this crisis for what it is and not what we imagine it to be. The people so convinced that the Crazies 2010 is happening to them are in fact acting like the citizens of the Crazies 1973. They've worsened an already unprecedented crisis through selfishness and childishness. And god damn it, does that drive me crazy.